The afternoon sun hung low over Maplewood, Illinois, casting long shadows across the quiet residential streets. It was October 15th, 1978, and 7-year-old Emma Hartley skipped down the sidewalk toward her best friend's house, her red jacket bright against the autumn leaves. Her mother, Patricia, watched from the front porch, waving as Emma turned the corner onto Birch Street. That would be the last time Patricia saw her daughter's face. When Emma didn't return by dinner, Patricia called her friend's mother, only to learn that Emma had never arrived. The 3-block walk should have taken less than 10 minutes. By nightfall, every neighbor on the street was searching, flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. By morning, the entire town had mobilized. Before we continue with Emma's story, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to stay updated on more compelling true stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. The Maplewood Police Department launched an immediate investigation. Detective Frank Russo, a 20-year veteran who'd handled everything from petty theft to armed robbery, had never worked a child abduction case. He stood in the Hartley living room, notebook in hand, watching Patricia sob into her husband's shoulder. David Hartley, a machinist at the local factory, kept repeating the same question. How does a child just disappear in broad daylight? The investigation consumed the small Illinois town. Volunteers organized search parties that combed through nearby parks, abandoned buildings, and the woods bordering the subdivision. Emma's school photo appeared on telephone poles, in grocery store windows, and on the evening news. She had brown hair cut into a bob, hazel eyes that seemed too wise for her age, and a gap between her front teeth that made her smile unforgettable. Detective Russo interviewed every resident on Emma's route. Old Mr. Peterson had been trimming his hedges and saw her walk past around 3:30. Mrs. Chen was returning from the grocery store and remembered the red jacket, but somewhere between Peterson's house and the corner store on Maple Avenue, Emma had simply vanished. No screams. No struggle, no witnesses. The FBI joined the investigation within 48 hours. Special Agent Robert Hayes brought resources that the small-town police department didn't have: behavioral analysts, forensic specialists, and access to national databases of known offenders. They questioned registered sex offenders within a 50-mile radius. They examined every car that had been reported stolen or abandoned. They chased down dozens of tips from people claiming to have seen a girl matching Emma's description in neighboring states. Nothing led anywhere. Patricia stopped sleeping. She kept Emma's room exactly as it had been. The stuffed animals arranged on the bed, the jump rope coiled by the door, the half-finished coloring book on the desk. David returned to work after 2 weeks because they needed the income. But his co-workers said he'd become a ghost of himself, mechanically going through the motions while his mind was clearly elsewhere. The media attention intensified, then gradually faded. By Christmas, Emma's case had been pushed off the front page by other news. By the following spring, the volunteer searches had stopped. Detective Russo kept the case file on his desk for 3 more years until his retirement, never quite able to let it go. He'd driven those 3 blocks hundreds of times, trying to understand how a child could vanish so completely. The Hartleys never moved. Patricia couldn't bear the thought of leaving the house where Emma might return. She kept the same phone number for decades, just in case. She attended support groups for families of missing children, finding a strange comfort among others who understood the unique torture of not knowing. David threw himself into advocacy work, pushing for better systems to track missing children, and helping to establish what would eventually become part of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Years turned into decades. The Hartleys aged, their hair graying, their faces etched with permanent sorrow. They celebrated Emma's birthday every year with a cake and candles, imagining what she might look like at 10, at 15, at 21. Patricia sometimes wondered if Emma was out there somewhere, living under a different name, perhaps not even remembering who she'd been. Other times, in her darkest moments, she accepted that Emma was probably gone, and at least knowing would provide some closure. In 2005, Detective Russo passed away from a heart attack. At his funeral, his daughter mentioned that he'd never stopped thinking about Emma Hartley, that he'd considered it his greatest failure. The case remained officially open but essentially cold, one of thousands of unsolved disappearances from that era. The breakthrough came from an entirely unexpected direction. In 2023, a woman named Jennifer Walsh submitted her DNA to a popular genealogy website, curious about her ancestry. Jennifer was 45 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, working as a graphic designer. She'd been raised by a single mother who died from cancer in 2019, taking whatever secrets she had to the grave. Among Jennifer's papers, she'd found only the vaguest information about her early childhood, a birth certificate that seemed oddly formal, a few baby photos, and a disturbing lack of documentation before age 8. Jennifer's DNA results showed the expected European ancestry, but they also pinged a match in the database, a distant cousin she'd never heard of. Out of curiosity, she reached out. The cousin, living in Indiana, mentioned that their family had a tragic history, a young girl named Emma who disappeared from Illinois in 1978. Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. She did the math. She would have been 7 in 1978. She contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, her hands shaking as she typed the email. Within days, investigators were on her doorstep. They collected DNA samples and compared them to genetic material that had been preserved from Emma's toothbrush and hairbrush, evidence that Detective Russo had meticulously maintained all those years ago. The match was definitive. Jennifer Walsh was Emma Hartley. The investigation into what happened during those missing years revealed a disturbing story. A woman named Gloria Reynolds had abducted Emma that October afternoon, offering her a ride because she'd supposedly seen Emma's cat run into a nearby yard. Gloria had been unable to have children of her own and had suffered a mental breakdown after her third miscarriage. She'd seen Emma walking alone, and in a moment of psychotic desperation, had taken her. Gloria had immediately left Illinois, driving west with Emma sedated in the back seat. She'd established a new life in Spokane, Washington, homeschooling the girl she now called Jennifer and keeping her isolated from other children for the first few years. She'd forged documents, created a false identity, and gradually convinced Emma, who was young enough to have her memories manipulated, that Patricia and David weren't her real parents, that they'd abandoned her, that Gloria had rescued her. The psychological manipulation had been profound. By the time Jennifer was old enough to question her circumstances, the lies had become her reality. Gloria had been a controlling but not physically abusive mother, providing for her material needs while systematically erasing her true identity. When authorities located Gloria Reynolds' last known address, they discovered she'd died in a car accident 4 years earlier, taking the truth with her. There would be no prosecution, no trial, no justice in the traditional sense. The reunion between Jennifer and her biological parents took place in a private room at the Maplewood Police Department on a grey morning in November 2023. Patricia, now 78, walked slowly with a cane, her hands trembling. David, 81, held her elbow, his eyes already wet with tears. Jennifer stood when they entered. This stranger who carried her genetic code, who had lived an entire lifetime in her absence. She'd spent weeks looking at old photos, trying to reconcile the 7-year-old girl in the red jacket with the woman she'd become. Her therapist had warned her that this would be complicated, that there was no script for this kind of reunion. Patricia made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "You have your grandmother's eyes," she whispered, reaching out tentatively. "I always said you had her eyes." They embraced awkwardly at first, then more tightly, 45 years of grief and loss pouring out in that small room. David joined them, forming a circle of 3 people bound by biology and trauma, separated by circumstances beyond their control. The following months were impossibly difficult. Jennifer had been robbed of her childhood, her identity, her family. She grieved for the life she should have had, while simultaneously mourning Gloria, the only mother she'd consciously known. Patricia and David struggled with the reality that their daughter was essentially a stranger, that they'd missed her entire life, her first day of high school, her college graduation, her wedding, the birth of her own children. Yes, Jennifer had children. Patricia and David discovered they were grandparents to 2 teenagers who'd grown up never knowing this part of their heritage. The family tree had grown in their absence, branches they'd never known existed. The media descended once again on Maplewood, now framing it as a miracle story, a cold case solved by modern technology. But for the people actually living through it, the reality was far more nuanced. There was joy in the reunion, certainly, but also profound loss that could never be recovered. Jennifer moved to Illinois 6 months after the DNA results were confirmed. She wanted to know this place, to walk the route she'd taken that October afternoon in 1978, to understand the life that had been stolen from her. She rented a house just a few blocks from her parents, close enough for regular visits, but maintaining the independence she'd cultivated over 45 years. They had dinner together every Sunday. Patricia would cook Emma's favorite childhood meals, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, chocolate chip cookies, hoping that some buried memory might be triggered by familiar tastes. Sometimes Jennifer would pause mid-bite, a strange sensation of déjà vu washing over her, though she couldn't be sure if these were genuine memories or just the power of suggestion. David spent hours showing her photo albums, narrating her early childhood, trying to reconstruct what had been lost. Here was Emma at 2, chasing bubbles in the backyard. Here she was at 5, dressed as a princess for Halloween. Here she was at 7, the last school photo before everything changed. Jennifer listened, looked, and tried to feel something beyond intellectual understanding. These were facts about a girl who no longer existed, a ghost version of herself that she could never retrieve. The investigation into Gloria Reynolds' background revealed her own tragic history. A woman who'd suffered multiple losses and had finally broken under the weight of her grief. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it provided context. A reminder that perpetrators are sometimes victims themselves, trapped in cycles of trauma they never resolved. The Maplewood community, which had mourned Emma's disappearance for 45 years, now struggled with how to respond to her return. Some organized a welcome home party, which Jennifer politely declined. Others approached her in the grocery store, wanting to share their memories of that terrible autumn, of the search parties they'd joined, of how they'd never forgotten her. She smiled and thanked them, but the attention was overwhelming. Her children, Tyler and Rebecca, adapted better than expected to their newly expanded family. They were curious about their grandparents, asking questions about history and genetics, building relationships from scratch. Tyler, at 17, became particularly close to David, spending hours in his grandfather's garage, learning to restore an old Chevrolet. Rebecca, 15, connected with Patricia over cooking and old family recipes. A year after the DNA revelation, the extended family gathered to celebrate what they called Emma Jennifer's first birthday in her original home. Not her actual birthday, but the anniversary of when she'd learned the truth. They ate cake and exchanged gifts, creating new traditions to fill the void left by decades of absence. Patricia had struggled with depression for months after the reunion, the reality of what she'd lost hitting her harder than she'd anticipated. The fantasy of Emma's return, which she'd nurtured for 45 years, couldn't match the complexity of the actual person who'd come back into her life. She loved Jennifer fiercely, but she also mourned Emma, the daughter who'd been frozen in time at 7 years old, who existed now only in memory and imagination. David found solace in action. He worked with legislators to strengthen laws protecting children, to improve database systems that could help solve cold cases faster. He became a spokesperson for DNA genealogy testing, encouraging families of missing persons to submit their genetic material to databases. Emma's case had been solved because someone had taken a consumer DNA test out of curiosity. Imagine how many other cases might be solved the same way. Jennifer herself struggled with identity in ways she'd never anticipated. She'd lived 45 years as one person and was now being asked to acknowledge she'd been someone else first. She attended therapy twice a week, working through the trauma of discovering that her entire childhood had been built on lies, that the woman she'd called mother had been her kidnapper, that somewhere in her unconscious mind were memories of another life, another family, another version of herself that had been violently erased. Sometimes, late at night, fragments would surface, the smell of Patricia's perfume triggering a vague sense of comfort, the sound of David's laugh producing a sensation of safety she couldn't quite place. Were these genuine memories or wishful thinking? She'd never know for certain. The case generated significant legal and ethical discussions. Could Jennifer sue Gloria Reynolds' estate for damages? Did she have any claim to the life she'd been denied? Could Patricia and David seek compensation for their suffering? These questions had no easy answers, no precedent that quite fit the circumstances. What emerged instead was a family determined to move forward rather than remain trapped in the past. They acknowledged the tragedy while refusing to let it define their future. They created new memories while honoring the old ones. They built relationships based not on what should have been, but on what actually was. 2 years after the DNA match, Jennifer stood in the yard of her childhood home, watching Tyler and Rebecca play with neighborhood kids. Patricia sat on the porch in the same chair where she'd watched Emma disappear 45 years earlier, but her expression now held peace rather than anguish. David grilled burgers, the smoke rising into the late afternoon sky. The story of Emma Hartley's disappearance and Jennifer Walsh's discovery had rippled outward, inspiring other families to pursue DNA testing, leading to several other cold cases being solved. Detective Russo's daughter established a scholarship in her father's name for students studying criminal justice, honoring his dedication to cases that others might have abandoned. The red jacket that Emma had worn that October day in 1978 remained in a box in Patricia's closet, too painful to look at, but impossible to discard. It represented both the worst day of her life and, in a strange way, the beginning of a story that had eventually found its resolution, even if not the one she'd imagined. On quiet evenings, Jennifer would sometimes drive those 3 blocks, retracing the route she'd walked as a 7-year-old girl. She'd park near where Mr. Peterson's house had stood, now torn down and replaced with a modern duplex. She'd look at the corner where she must have encountered Gloria Reynolds, where her life had taken an unimaginable turn. She'd sit there in her car, trying to feel something, to remember something, to connect with that child she'd been. Mostly, she felt gratitude for the technology that had revealed the truth, for parents who'd never stopped hoping, for children who'd embraced a complicated history with remarkable grace, for the possibility of beginning again even after 45 years of living someone else's story. The case remained a reminder of both the worst and best of humanity, the capacity for individuals to commit terrible acts in moments of desperation, but also the resilience of families, the persistence of love across decades of separation, and the power of truth to eventually surface, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Emma Hartley had vanished in 1978. Jennifer Walsh had lived an entire life. Now they were somehow the same person, carrying both histories forward, proof that identity is more complex than a name, that family is built through choice as much as biology, and that some stories, no matter how long they take to unfold, eventually find their way home. In the spring of 2024, Jennifer made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She wanted to visit Spokane, to see the house where she'd grown up as Jennifer, to walk through the neighborhoods where Gloria Reynolds had raised her. Patricia initially resisted, hurt by what felt like a validation of the kidnapper's life. But David understood. She needs to reconcile both parts of herself, he told his wife gently. We can't ask her to erase 45 years just because they were built on a lie. Jennifer made the trip alone, driving across the country with a recording device and her therapist's phone number saved in her favorites. The house on Pinecrest Avenue looked smaller than she remembered, the paint now a different color, the oak tree in the front yard significantly taller. A young family lived there now, a couple with 3 kids who had no idea of the home's dark history. She didn't knock on the door. Instead, she sat in her rental car across the street, memories flooding back with unexpected intensity. Gloria teaching her to ride a bike on this sidewalk, the bedroom window on the 2nd floor where she'd spent countless hours reading, the corner store where Gloria would let her pick out candy on Fridays. These memories were real, regardless of how they'd come to exist. At Gloria's grave in Riverside Cemetery, Jennifer stood for nearly an hour, wrestling with emotions she couldn't untangle. Anger at the woman who'd stolen her childhood, grief for the only mother she'd consciously known, confusion about how to hold both truths simultaneously. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, acknowledging the complexity, refusing to simplify what couldn't be simplified. Back in Maplewood, the investigation into the original abduction had revealed something Patricia and David had never known. On that October afternoon in 1978, 3 other mothers had reported suspicious encounters with a woman matching Gloria's description. A woman asking if they'd seen a lost puppy, offering children rides, lingering too long near playgrounds. The reports had been filed but never connected. Emma had simply been the unlucky one, the child who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, vulnerable for just a moment. This knowledge haunted Patricia in new ways. Emma's disappearance hadn't been random bad luck or divine punishment for some imagined failure. It had been a predator actively hunting, and Emma had happened to cross her path. The randomness of it somehow made it worse. Jennifer's own children struggled with their newfound history in different ways. Tyler became obsessed with genealogy, building out the family tree, connecting with distant relatives through DNA databases, trying to map out all the relationships that had existed unknown to him. He started a blog, documenting the experience of discovering his mother's true identity, which gained a surprising following among adoptees and others with complicated family histories. Rebecca, more private by nature, withdrew initially. She'd loved her grandmother, the woman she'd known as Grandma Gloria, and now had to reconcile that love with the knowledge of what Gloria had done. Her school counselor worked with her on understanding that people can be both harmful and loving, that humans contain multitudes, that acknowledging complexity doesn't mean excusing actions. In the fall of 2024, Patricia was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She'd spent 45 years desperately holding on to memories of Emma, and now her mind would slowly erase everything. David struggled to maintain his composure when the neurologist explained the prognosis. They had 5 years, maybe 10, before Patricia wouldn't remember any of this. Not the disappearance, not the decades of searching, not even the miraculous reunion. Jennifer increased her visits, now coming to her parents' house almost daily. She brought photo albums and asked Patricia to narrate the pictures while she still could. She recorded hours of audio, Patricia's voice describing Emma's first steps, her first day of kindergarten, the Christmas morning she'd gotten the bicycle she'd begged for. These recordings would become precious artifacts, proof that Patricia had known her, had loved her, had never forgotten. They also recorded new memories. Patricia teaching Jennifer how to make her famous apple pie. David showing her how to change a tire, a skill he'd always planned to teach his daughter. Jennifer learning the family history, great-grandparents who'd immigrated from Ireland, an uncle who died in Vietnam, a cousin who'd become a minor league baseball player. All the stories that should have been passed down naturally over dinners and holidays were now being compressed into whatever time they had left. The Maplewood community rallied around them. Former members of the 1978 search parties, now elderly themselves, came to visit, sharing their own memories of that terrible time. The local newspaper ran a follow-up series on the case, focusing not on the sensational aspects, but on the quieter story of a family rebuilding itself against impossible odds. Jennifer connected with other children who'd been abducted and later recovered, finding unexpected kinship with people who understood the peculiar trauma of having your identity stolen. There was Janice, taken at age 6 and found at 19, Marcus, abducted at 8 and recovered at 32. Each story was unique, but they all shared the common thread of living in the space between two lives, never quite belonging fully to either. Through these connections, Jennifer began advocating for better support systems for recovered missing persons. She testified before state legislatures about the need for specialized therapy, legal assistance in reclaiming identities, and financial support for families navigating impossible complications. Emma's case, she argued, had been solved by luck and technology. How many others remained unsolved simply because the right DNA match hadn't been made? David threw his remaining energy into helping other families. He worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to develop protocols for DNA database submissions. He lobbied genealogy companies to create specific programs for law enforcement access. He couldn't give Patricia back the 45 years they'd lost, but he could help ensure fewer families endured the same agony. Tyler graduated high school in the spring of 2025 and decided to study forensic science, directly inspired by the technology that had revealed his family's hidden history. At his graduation party, held in the same backyard where Emma had played as a child, 3 generations gathered: Patricia and David, Jennifer, Tyler, and Rebecca, plus extended family members who'd mourned Emma and now welcomed Jennifer. Patricia, her memory already beginning to slip, kept asking Jennifer when Emma was coming home. Jennifer would gently remind her mother that she was Emma, would hold her hand and say, "I'm here, Mom. I came home." Sometimes Patricia would understand and weep with joy. Other times she'd look confused, this middle-aged woman claiming to be her 7-year-old daughter. David would intervene quietly, redirecting the conversation, protecting them both from the cruelty of a disease that stole even miraculous reunions. On October 15, 2025, 47 years to the day since Emma's disappearance, the family held a private ceremony at the Maplewood Community Park. They planted an oak tree with a small plaque that read simply, "In memory of lost time and in celebration of found family." No last names, no details, just an acknowledgement that something had been lost and something else had been found. Jennifer stood beside the freshly planted tree, her children on one side and her elderly parents on the other, and felt the weight of 2 lifetimes pressing down on her shoulders. She was Emma Hartley, the 7-year-old girl who'd walked down Birch Street in a red jacket and never arrived at her destination. She was Jennifer Walsh, the woman who'd built a life, raised children, and believed she knew who she was. She was both and neither, a living bridge between two realities that should never have existed simultaneously. The sun set over Maplewood that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In houses up and down the street, families gathered for dinner, children played in yards. The ordinary rhythms of suburban life continued unchanged. But in the Hartley home, now occupied again by people bound by the most extraordinary circumstances, something rare and precious had been salvaged from tragedy. Patricia's lucid moments became less frequent as autumn deepened, but in those brief windows of clarity, she would look at Jennifer with recognition that transcended disease and time and say, "You came back to me. My Emma came back." And Jennifer, who had learned to live in the complicated space between identities, would simply hold her mother's hand and reply, "I'm here. I'm finally home." The story of Emma Hartley's disappearance and recovery spread far beyond Maplewood. It inspired legislative changes in 3 states regarding DNA databases and missing persons cases. It prompted thousands of families to submit genetic material to genealogy sites, leading to the resolution of 17 other cold cases within 2 years. It became a case study in forensic science programs and psychology departments, an example of how trauma and identity intersect in ways we're only beginning to understand. But for the people actually living it, the story was simpler and more profound. It was about a family torn apart by violence and mental illness, scattered across decades and geography, brought back together by science and persistence and the stubborn refusal to stop hoping. It was about the limits of justice. Gloria Reynolds would never face trial, Emma's stolen childhood could never be returned, and the possibilities of grace. It was about learning that sometimes there are no clean endings, no perfect resolutions, no way to make whole what has been shattered. Sometimes all you can do is gather the pieces, acknowledge what's been lost, and build something new from what remains. Sometimes that has to be enough. And on Sunday evenings, when 3 generations gathered around the dinner table, passing dishes and sharing stories, creating new memories while honoring old ones, it was enough. It had to be. It was all they had, and somehow, miraculously, it was everything.